Okay, big welcome to everyone to today's Talent Navigator series, all focused on building your next generation contingent workforce strategy with MSP 4.0. I think without a doubt, the last 18 months has driven rapid evolution of talent acquisition strategies and really accelerated the role of the contingent workforce when it comes to driving scalability and flexibility. And I think even more critically, breaking down those talent silos and thinking about how to bring work to talent and no longer talent to work. And we call that really how do you best organize work to create that distinctive talent advantage. So I'm really excited today to be hosting our MSP 4.0 series with Everest Group. And I'd just like to introduce our speakers for the session. A big welcome to Arkadev Basak, or I think many of you may already know on the webinar today, fondly known to us as Arko. Arko is a leader in the business services process team at Everest, and he assists clients across a range of topics from HR and talent services value chain, permanent contingent talent acquisition, payroll, benefits, learning, the broader spectrum of talent management, and right across multi-process HRO. He also leads Everest's recruitment process outsourcing, managed service provider, and HR outsourcing offerings. So we have an absolute expert in the market today who is really consulting with customers and providers on how they're elevating and evolving their talent acquisition strategies. What I think is probably one of the most interesting and exciting talent markets that we've worked in what we're seeing in the dynamics of the market. Joining Arko today is Mike Smith, our global CEO of Randstad Sourceright. And Mike also brings a wealth of experience in the talent acquisition industry in his role as our global CEO. Mike first joined Randstad back in January 2005. So if we want to talk about internal talent mobility, Mike is an exceptional example, starting from a graduate recruitment executive. And I've had the pleasure of working with Mike for a very long time now, to really leading operational teams and roles across MD of Southeast Asia, CEO of Randstad UK, MD of Randstad Sourceright EMEA, and recently just moving. He's been a bit of a global trotter from Sydney to Singapore to Amsterdam, and now moving to Houston, Texas as our global CEO. Mike has always focused on how do we consistently elevate our customer value propositions to really help meet the demands of talent acquisition and CHRO leaders today, and really look at how do you create competitive talent models that bring people, process, and transformative technology together. So a big welcome to you both. I'm Louisa Wilson. I head up our Enterprise Customer Acceleration team, and I look forward to navigating a dynamic conversation with Mike and Arko today on what is happening in our marketplace and how is that really driving this evolution of the contingent workforce approach. So what we're going to cover today, we're going to take a dip into that dynamic market and world that's out there today that's been disrupted by COVID. And I think we can see some transformative impacts that are here to stay for the long term. We're going to see how that's really evolved the MSP story and seen the emergence of what we're seeing as an increased value proposition and business impact created by MSP 4.0. And then we're going to dive into some of the key elements of MSP 4.0 and the implications for your business and how you can start to look at, is your contingent talent model keeping pace with the demands of business today, but also how talent would like to work. So we are going to get ourselves started, and it is going to be a Q&A across the team. And we're going to start looking first at that contingent workforce landscape. And as mentioned, a lot of the changes that we're seeing as a result of COVID will have that transformative impact. We've certainly seen some dramatic swings and roundabouts over the last 18 months. And I think we're now seeing some areas we've got what we call that slingshot recovery. So let's start to have a look into these changes that we've been faced with and how has that evolved our contingent workforce model. So Arko, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thanks, Louisa. It's great to be here. So good. Teeing off with the fact that it's a dynamic world, and while COVID introduced a lot of changes, some of them were actually already in place before COVID happened. So if you think about evolving customer expectations, even before COVID, candidates and customers across the globe, they want the real-time response. They want the real-time interaction, self-service options, consistency across channels. We're looking at a lot of turbulent geopolitical environment in terms of trade wars, protectionism. The workforce mix was already changing. Gig workforce was already big. And then in terms of the generations of workforce, we saw millennials and Gen Z coming in. And last but not the least, technology innovation and disruptions had already caught pace, before this. So not only was it accelerating at a dramatic pace, we also finally saw really large scale adoption of technology happening. So in this context, we saw COVID happening, and that to me introduced a new element around risk management and business continuity planning. Which again became very important in terms of enterprises' business priorities. So, Mike, as you and Randstad Sourceright, navigated through COVID and helped your customers, how do you see these elements playing out?
Yeah, thank you, Akko, and thank you, Lou, for the embarrassing introduction. From our perspective, I think we could probably spend 45 minutes on this slide alone, but allow me to maybe pick out maybe 2 or 3 key elements that I think we see as fundamental changes that are occurring with at least our client base at the moment, which we think is pretty representative of the broader landscape. So firstly, we see that organizations are generally more open to employing individuals in locations that they had not considered previously from a contingent basis. And interesting, just last week, we got a few data points that really kind of concretely support this. Typically in conversations with customers, you see that, look, yeah, there's a real desire to want to do it, but to make that fundamental step of changing the hiring manager's thought processes, challenging the way that work was done previously, hasn't technically happened at the widespread adoption that we would have liked it to. We're now seeing that change. So within our own Randstad data from both our operating companies and our MSPs, we've been tracking data quarter on quarter, which shows the median distance between the actual employee's office, so in, the place where they're supposed to go to work, and the home address and where that individual is working. And what we continue to see is that quarter on quarter, that has increased exponentially, that median distance, which shows this continual trend toward organizations slowly adopting that thought process of it's okay to have people in a situation where they may never come to the office. And it's the first concrete data set that we have that supports that. Secondly, we often get asked, is this just a transitory approach? Is it something more structural that's happening? And the data point that we have that supports that is through our customer surveys with our customers, we're asking them, are you making fundamental changes to the way you are setting up your real estate portfolio to support hybrid working? And we've seen over 70% of our customers come back and say, we're restructuring our office locations and our main offices to be a place where people meet to talk about work rather than to get work done, which is another major supporting element of that change of really bedding down and leaning into this hybrid remote working situation. Secondly, you've seen organizations recognize that having an outsourced partner that can help you with a scalable or agile workforce that has that just-in-time, just-in-case supply chain is a good ally to have during the last crisis. And as a result of that, we've seen our RFI and RFP volumes in MSP and RPO just tremendously increase at the outset of COVID and continues post-COVID. And lastly, I think you see that organizations are thinking in a much more evolutionary way about their workforce. They're making those concrete steps to say, this is less about defined vehicles of employment for certain skill sets and more about having multiple vehicles in which you can capture the skill sets that you need to get work done in the future. But they'd be the 3 that really stand out for me.
Thanks, Mike. And I think that we have a very interesting workforce landscape now combined with a super interesting economic landscape, which is causing some of the greatest trends as it relates to the talent demand supply gap. And, Arko, you're going to share with us now some insight into what that looks like and what the impact is on salaries, how we roll, what roles we're recruiting in what manner, etc., because it is unprecedented in its impact. Back to you, Arko.
Yeah, absolutely, Louisa. Now that we are recovering from COVID, the business environment is super dynamic once again. And I think one of the biggest impacts of that is in terms of the demand supply gap. And I think US is probably the worst off in terms of this, but we are seeing this impact slowly spreading across the globe as most countries come out of the COVID cycle. So if you look at the graph over here, this is simply unthinkable, right? There are more job openings today than people actually trying to look for jobs. And this means an unprecedented demand-supply gap, not just for high-skilled roles, say in technology or in healthcare, but actually across the board, right? From entry-level roles to the really high-end roles. So, Mike, what are you seeing across the globe, and how is this impacting your services and your customers?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously the US is going through an unprecedented labor crunch at the moment, but we absolutely see that in other markets. So in the Netherlands, for example, the CBS recently reported that job vacancies significantly outnumber the number of unemployed people within the Netherlands at the moment. I think that the last total job vacancy count in the Netherlands was around 327,000, which is the highest job vacancy figure ever. In the UK, we see similar stories. The staff shortage there reported at the moment is 14 times the normal level. And what you see is this really strong flow-on effect to the predicted growth rates as a result of that. So the UK now reporting growth rates similar to the February when they first went into lockdown. And then a super interesting statistic from a supply-demand perspective is I think the head of talent acquisition for an organisation based out of Australia called Canva more recently stated that from an indicator of how tight the market is in trying to find people at the moment. If you look on LinkedIn, there's currently 362,000 vacancies globally for recruiters or talent acquisition related individuals. And there's 340,000 vacancies for software engineers. So you can imagine the unprecedented demand for our services at the moment. I mean, we as an organisation within Randstad Sourceright, having 700 customers and having in excess of kind of 3,500 FTE already, currently have 850 global vacancies for recruiters. And it's just an incredibly difficult time to find recruiters, let alone to help our customers find talent at the moment. And what you see is this compressed business demand cycle almost leads to just what was previously unthought of needs of agility and scalability for customers. And I think MSP 4.0, which we'll talk about later today, is one way in which you can design to relieve some of that pressure of those unprecedented compressions in that business demand cycle.
Yeah, Mike, and if I have to sort of extend your logic, it's not just difficult to find recruiters to hire other people, but I'm hearing people struggling to find recruiters to hire recruiters, right? It's that bad.
Oh, yeah.
But the two sort of follow-ups or two impacts of this unprecedented demand talent supply gap is, number one, we are seeing what we call the Great Resignation. So our own Everest Group survey, we just finished conducting it. So if you look at the graph over here, a lot of organizations are mentioning that attrition levels have gone up dramatically in the last 3 months itself. Around 10% are saying it went up by over 25 percentage points. Overall, 10% change in attrition levels. So that's one big concern for enterprises. And then if we move to the next slide, something very aligned to that is rapid increase in pay rates and salaries. And once more, what we see is this is not just limited to one part of the workforce, but it extends across the entire chain. We are seeing that the minimum wage is default minimum wage has actually increased to 15 and actually is continuously rising. And even for higher end jobs, salaries are rising. Organizations are giving, doling out one-time bonuses. And again, this is happening across the globe, in US, in Europe, in India, other parts of Asia Pacific. So that really makes this a challenging environment. So Mike, in these situations, how do you see organizations' workforce strategy changing?
Yeah, so I think the most telling statistic here is the one on the left-hand side, which is that out of our talent trend survey more recently, which involved a plethora global talent and procurement leaders, they said 77% are focused on increasing workforce agility more than ever before. And in the current environment, after everything we just talked about, why wouldn't you be? But I think it's important to note here that what's become increasingly more difficult is that ability to workforce plan. And I think all organizations, if they're honest with themselves, probably would acknowledge that they have room for improvement in the area of workforce planning, even pre-COVID and effectively post-COVID. That has made it even more difficult. And within our client base, we see lots of organizations taking a real pragmatic approach to this for the first time and say, it's impossible to workforce plan for all of our skill sets. We've got some core skill sets that we really feel like we've got large amounts of employees in this area. We've got a good indicator of what turnover is going to be looking like. Those roles play a key strategy in supporting our overall achievement of our business goals. Let's workforce plan for those particular skill sets. So if I have, for example, 1,000 software engineers, and we know there's 20% turnover a year, then I know I'm going to have a good talent pool of those workers. What you see is a shift in thinking about, instead of just talent pooling permanent workers for that, I'm going to also look at gig workers. I'm going to look at freelancers. I'm going to look at independent contractors. I'm going to have supply chains within those areas that help me be able to scale in a just-in-time or just-in-case way, to ensure that they have the ability to really have those core skill sets that drive a disproportionate amount of value creation for their organizations. Then second to that, you see organizations start thinking much more holistically around building out multiple vehicles in which they can capture talent. So this idea of, I need to have SOW, permanent scalability, traditional contingent workers, and freelance vehicles that are covered off, so that if we identify a micro vein or pocket of really unique skill sets that demand to be employed as freelancers or contingent workers, we need to have a seamless vehicle to enable our hiring managers to get access to that talent. And whilst we might not have been intentional about that roadmap previously, I see a significant amount of organizations proactively building that out so that they have this fortified, future-proof way of getting access to skills that their business needs, because they don't know how candidates are going to declare that they want to be employed in the future. And I mean, it's an embellished example, but if you imagine if tomorrow all the cybersecurity individuals in financial services woke up and said, I'm going to be a freelancer, an independent contractor. Well, the organizations that have already very proactively built out the ability to seamlessly engage and retain those individuals with a great contingent value proposition are obviously going to be able to win in that war for getting that talent. So we feel very strongly in recommending, but we also see that organizations are starting to really build up that capability to be able to be in a situation where they fortify that workforce plan through having multiple ways in which they can get work done, which weren't as flexible or agile as they were previously.
Thanks, Mike. And I think between you and Arko, you teed up really well in terms of creating a very compelling platform to evolve your contingent talent model. And Mike and Arko, it sounds like we might need to find some micro pockets of recruiters out there based on the level of demand that we're seeing in the marketplace today. But we have seen all of those trends also converge with what was happening in the MSP story start to really create the new MSP story. So we're now going to start diving into what does MSP 4.0 look like? How have we got here? And what does the emergence of this new approach to contingent talent look like? So I'm going to hand over to Arko now, who's going to really talk about why we're seeing this rapid evolution of the value proposition. And it's great to see, Arko, in terms of resilience, MSP is a considered and considerable platform for contingent talent optimization. So Arko, back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Louisa. If I look at a little bit of the history, purely in terms of numbers and growth, MSP was growing at a pretty decent pace. Organizations were using the MSP model. It was quite successful. And then, of course, COVID happened. Understandably, large part of the contingent workforce was let go. And, the graph and the numbers show the decline in the contingent workforce and MSP market growth in the beginning of last year. But what really happened after that was, it was a unprecedented situation. But the MSP industry, Randstad Sourceright, as well as a large number of the competitors, really performed well and managed the entire difficult situation great. And that is where our satisfaction survey shows that 80% of MSP buyers were actually highly satisfied with their provider's COVID-19 response. In fact, the average performance was better in 2020 than it was in 2019. And that led to what Louisa, you called a slingshot recovery, as organizations turn towards MSPs to better manage their contingent workforce. And what we are seeing today is a large number of first generation buyers coming into the market, looking at the MSP model. They realize that this is a part of the workforce they can't ignore anymore, and they need better help and support to manage it. As well as we see second and third generation buyers really looking to revamp and bring in this new MSP 4.0 model with all the latest and the greatest into the mix.
Ako, I'm going to interject with a quick question from the audience here. We've had a couple of questions come through. I'm going to save one for later in the Q&A. But Ako, did you see any differential in satisfaction by buyers of MSP? We have seen an increased role of HR in buying MSP programs. Can you see any differences between satisfaction for HR or procurement in your findings? And how satisfied is HR?
Not really, no real difference, but I think you're completely right that HR is getting more involved, and that has helped both the organizations in terms of how they manage their contingent workforce, and it has actually helped the MSPs in terms of providing better and more strategic services. The entire mindset of the industry, both the consumers, which is the enterprises, as well as the MSPs, has changed with the greater involvement of HR.
And Ako, that's a really nice segue to really how are the value propositions evolving. And we talk about MSPs taking a full talent lens focus. So Mike and Ako, I'd love to hear from you now in terms of where is the value proposition of MSP evolving, and what can organization expect as that level of impact on their contingent workforce models?
Yeah, absolutely, Louisa. I think you're right. Talent is or will be the most distinguishing aspect of MSP 4.0. Earlier there was a lot of focus on cost. That hasn't gone away. That's still very important. But COVID made organizations realize how important contingent workforce is in terms of the overall organization's workforce strategy. And that is where we feel everything in MSP 4.0 will ultimately revolve around talent. And then, Mike, I think you teed up very well in terms of how extreme agility, scalability, and flexibility is important, especially when some of these complete sudden shocks come into the system, and how MSP actually helps organizations deal with that. A couple of other things which are really important is ultimately, Mike, you mentioned this brings visibility to the entire contingent workforce. And if I extend it further, it actually brings in, or is actually the doorway for total talent management, where permanent and contingent workforce or entire company's workforce is actually looked at in a holistic manner. And that is where we now feel that the MSP providers and the MSP programs will now be able to actively contribute to business outcomes rather than just piecemeal execution sort of here and there. So Mike, how do you see this playing out with your clients, with the sort of new RFPs that you are getting?
Yeah, so I think the first call out around cost compliance and visibility being kind of a foundational expectation of customers absolutely still rings true. What the major theme I think we're seeing within the 4.0 value proposition and requests from customers who are going through their third or fourth generation of an MSP is this real focus on the ability to continue to transform and evolve the overall value proposition of an MSP and the value that creates for the buyer. So firstly, as you mentioned, you see an increased focus on the quality of contingent talent and using the MSP as the gateway to total talent management. But interestingly, we see that in order to be able to get there, there's a heavy focus on making sure that the process that is deployed to recruit contingent talent, whether that be vendor neutral or direct source or mixed, etc., is A, very, very data driven, B, design-led thinking, and C, is really synonymous with the experience of the client's brand and products. And we see that customers want this so that you can really start to leverage the exponential efficiencies of having that data, provide a superior stakeholder experience, and then understand how you are actively contributing to biggest business outcomes. And I think a good example of that is we have a few financial services clients within our portfolio at the moment, and within their recent MSP bids, they specifically requested that the whole process should be really agile, efficient, and highly predictive, but it also needs to feel really like a consumer experience. So in short, they wanted to provide a really seamless customer journey for their contingent candidates where they get constant feedback loops, and many of them talk to it about just like opening a bank account. It needs to be, whether it's direct source or vendor neutral, it needs to be seamless. That leaves that candidate walking away feeling really, really positive about the experience, no matter where they finish in the process. And then I think there's probably just two other little tidbits to that. Firstly, we see organizations really wanting to dig into that data, that end-to-end data. They want to know, where does my most successful source of contingent hire come from? Coming back to that point about talent being the number one distinguishing factor. If I introduce an assessment as part of this process, how does it reduce attrition in my call centers? And what impact does that have on customer satisfaction? And how does that impact my revenue per head? How was talent pooling in a particular skill set that we didn't do previously decrease time to fill on a quarter by quarter basis? So this understanding of how does data, how can I answer these kind of questions by having this end-to-end data process is really going to become, or we already see, a staple of that MSP 4.0 offering.
Thanks, Mike. And, if we have a look at the research that you've got coming in from customers, our own customers, as well as, your understanding of the provider landscape, Arko, you've coined the MSP 4.0. It's an 8D approach. So, Arko, tell us about all of these Ds, and I then think we're going to take a deep dive into a few of them to give a reflection and insight in as how can they assist organizations to really fight against some of the challenges around talent today and really optimize their contingent workforce models. So, Arko, the 8Ds.
Yeah, it's a nice catchphrase that we have made, which is 8D. But I think in a way, none of these are shockers or completely new, and Mike attributed to quite a few of these already. And we'll deep dive into some of these later. But a couple of ones which I wanted to quickly mention, which we may not get time to deep dive today, is one, distributed and dispersed talent. So Mike talked about the work from home situation and a hybrid solution. So while in one way it's a challenge for all organizations, in another way it's also an opportunity. It actually throws the entire world wide open in terms of where you can get talent, and that fits in very well with the talent demand supply gap that we are seeing in some geographies. Can talent from across the globe help solve for that? But yeah, the details of each of these are in the paper, but in the remaining few slides, we'll deep down on a couple of those, or probably 4 or 5 of these.
Thanks, Arko. So we'll be sharing the white paper after the session today. So let's take a now look into one of the first levers of 4.0, which is the design thinking led consumer experience. And I think Mike mentioned that well in terms of, a lot of banking customers are thinking about how do they bring the same level of consumer experience to their talent and now to their contingent talent. So Arko, you talk about design thinking led consumer experience. Can you tell us what this means for employers and how they're really translating this to elevate the experience for their contingent talent?
Yeah, absolutely, Louisa. The first thing I really want to stress on is it's not just about superior experience for the candidates, but superior experience for everyone involved here, including the hiring managers. In today's world, in the demand talent supply world, where it's so difficult to get talent, the hiring managers are under equal pressure, and it's very important to provide them the right experience as well. And ultimately, the design thinking part of it means really understanding the needs and requirements of all these stakeholders, whether it's candidates, whether it's the hiring managers, and design the entire solution according to that, whether it's the process part of it, the people part of it, the technology part of it. Everything ultimately needs to be designed to solve for the needs and requirements of all the stakeholders, and ultimately provide them the same level of consumer experience, the personalized experience that they get when they are shopping on an Amazon or watching movies on a Netflix. So Mike, how is this sort of planning out when you are talking with your customers, when you are solving problems for your customers?
Yeah, so firstly, I think it's a no-brainer that the world continues to move towards these increased expectations of hyper-personalization, and we see that play out in a couple of ways. Firstly, if we think about it purely from a candidate and MSP/client perspective, we see clients being more deliberate about wanting to understand what does the recruitment process look like for contingent talent, and working in partnership with MSP, either in a direct source or vendor neutral model, to design what that process looks like. And for an example, the way that you build a recruitment experience for a contingent worker who's a call center worker versus a maintenance engineer versus a data scientist is different. And subsequently, you see organizations saying, I want to be in a situation where the experience should be tailored to the type of process that leads to the most efficient and effective flow of contingent talent through that funnel, impacting speed. Secondly, we want to make sure that the process that we design or mandate with our providers or MSP has a high predictability post-hire on the quality of talent, leading to a higher stakeholder satisfaction. And then obviously making sure that the overall experience for the contingent candidate is still a positive one, leading to a positive association with that brand. That then, on the flip side, reverses when you're dealing with different hiring managers within the organization. So if you're with someone who continues to recruit 50 of the same contingent workers, or the way that you would engage from a talent insights and consultation perspective with that hiring manager is different to someone who utilizes the MSP 20 times a year for niche talent, where you'll need to come with much more relevant and detailed insights about what the market looks like for that particular niche talent. So it really does force the MSP 4.0 value proposition to be able to get to a much more specialized way of delivery and break up stakeholders based on those segments that I mentioned, enable a process that leads to the right level of experience for candidates and hiring managers, so that you can continue to elevate the overall value creation of the service.
Thanks, Mike. And I think from all of that, we can critically see how important contingent talent is now to organizations. And, Marco, you mentioned that HR is becoming far more engaged in the model. When we move to the next D, I think it's really, I've heard Mike say underpinning all of what we're doing today is how to use data to really provide predictive insight on where and how to recruit an employer, or what nature to employ a contractor, etc. So enabling all of MSP 4.0 is this notion that it's data and digital driven, and it's an integrated platform approach. So Arko, I'd love to hear what you've heard from organizations. I call this a bit of the digital and data nirvana on the slide right now. I think organizations are still looking at how do you best integrate to provide this really complementary analytics approach. So Arko, tell me a little bit more about this D.
Yeah, absolutely, Luisa. If I look at this, good-looking diagram over here, individually, I think, each of the elements over here, probably most organizations are using them in some form or fashion. The true differentiation that is happening in MSP 4.0 is what, Luisa, you mentioned, is the integrated and the platform approach. That is what makes MSP 4.0 very different from what we had seen seen earlier. So what do we mean by this integrated platform approach? So, all of us know there are literally hundreds, probably thousands of tools and platforms out there, looking at various aspects of talent acquisition, whether permanent or contingent talent acquisition. In MSP 4.0, what we see happening is all of these coming together into one seamless, integrated, ecosystem of, technology. So what does that mean? How does that translate into real world is there should be something like an integration layer or middleware, which puts all of these technologies together to ultimately derive two things. One, seamless flow of data from one system to another across geographies, across business units, so that you can really get those great predictive analytics that Mike was talking about. If each system sort of sits separately from each other, you can't have that great analytics. That's one. And the second is ultimately to the end user, whether it's the candidates or the suppliers or the hiring managers or even the MSP workers. It should look and feel like one platform and one technology and provide that consistent experience rather than someone logging into 10 different systems each time you need to do something. So that is the underpinning and the big change that we see in terms of moving from discrete tools to one integrated platform. So Mike, what is Randstad Sourceright doing over here? This is easier said than done. And as Luisa mentioned, it looks more like Nirvana. What is Randstad Sourceright doing over here?
Yeah, so this is probably my favorite slide, and we've made some deliberate decisions to build out this integrated ecosystem platform that's underpinned by what we call a customer data platform at the moment. And maybe it's good just to touch on the reasons why we've done that. So we've seen over time that a lot of clients within their permanent talent acquisition process have HCM, a CRM, and an ATS platform, and they build out quite a complex architecture, often with third-party point solutions that allows them to be able to create personalized processes for each type of worker that they want to hire. And in many of the art of the possible sessions we have with MSP customers, they often, 1 or 2 years ago, talked about this desire to have somewhat of a similar process. So this hyper-personalized recruitment processes underpinned by data for their contingent workforce, but with a better balance for agility and speed. And when we asked them, what's stopping you from doing that? They said, look, we struggled enough to get sign off to do it for our permanent recruitment process, let alone to get the budget, to dedicate the IT resources, to move off of the internal sign-offs on data privacy and information security, and then actually to bring on our own third-party HR point solutions as part of our contingent process. It's incredibly cumbersome. So as a result of that, what we think that the MSP 4.0 proposition needs to be is one platform that shortcuts that for the customer, that has a native integration with their VMS, and that platform then acts as the wrapper by which subsequent integrations occur with that platform, saving customers huge amounts of time, money, energy, efficiencies, sign-offs, etc., still to get that art of the possible experience for contingent talent and predictability and data, but with far less time, energy, and resources on their end. I think important to note here is that when we talk about that platform, our suggestion is that that's always built in a microservices style architecture, because what happens over time is you may choose a particular skills assessment for your digital IT talent, and over time that a better assessment comes out that has a high predictability around those skills, and you want to be able to go to your provider should come to you very proactively and say, good news, there's a new assessment that we've tested and validated is the better way to potentially assess skills in this contingent category. And we're going to plug this out and we're going to plug that new assessment into you as part of that process. Here's the A/B testing that we've done that shows that it still leads to a greater efficiency of flow of candidates through that funnel, etc. We've seen customers that sort of integrated platform play really resonate. There's two other elements to that platform that are really important. The first is the customer data platform, which allows you to, your point earlier, to kind of run all sorts of analysis that can lead to predictive analytics, prescriptive analytics, that can run early warning signs, etc. And it allows you to A/B test the process. If we put the hiring manager interview here versus the assessment here, what happens to conversion and offer acceptance rates, what happens to time to hire, etc., etc. And then lastly is this really automated marketing engine. And that's where you're able to kind of really garner the efficiencies that customers expect in the MSP 4.0 proposition. So typically where you have recruiters building automated or trying to build marketing content and curated journeys for individuals in an integrated platform, you should have a marketing tech stack that's part of that, which says if a candidate looks at one of our advertisements in a direct sourcing model and doesn't actually apply, how are they automatically retargeted? How do we continue to send content curation to them based on their job or skill set? And then when do we send a trigger to a direct source recruiter that reaches out to them over time, for example? Having that ability to plug in third-party technology seamlessly, the customer data platform and that marketing engine underpinning it, we see having tremendous impact on cost, time, and quality hire for most of our customers currently. And I think
so I think we can all see that this is a very passionate area for Mike. I'm going to do a quick time check. We've got about 20 minutes to go and a few Ds to go as well. But Mike, I think it's really important for us to bring this to life for the audience today because, we want to make sure that everyone understands we're talking about, the theory behind MSP 4.0, but many of these things are coming to life for customers. And one great example was how do you really build that consumer-like experience for talent and have similar experiences across both your permanent and your contingent talent moving forward. So Mike, do you want to share with us how we're working with one of our clients to bring this to life?
Sure, I was going to say, I think we've got some examples in the next slide. So here you can see we've just deployed 2 third-party technologies that integrate into our platform, into the VS for one of our customers at the moment. And we've just deliberately made it quite simple by segregating between what we call niche skilled talent and high volume talent. So if you are a niche skilled individual and you come to the Contingent Talent Careers portal that we built on behalf of this specific customer, we have live chat recruiters sitting in our shared service centers globally. And as and when someone looks at a particular job, we try to catch that candidate in a micro moment of job seeking behavior. So we will effectively jump in and say, hey, we noticed that you're looking at the analytics and insights manager role. Do you have any questions that I can answer for you about that? If you're interested in a confidential and speculative conversation, I can reach out and tell you more about the organization. Secondly, if you look at the volume piece, and here we have a customer care representative, whenever I click apply for that role, we have an automated chatbot that immediately screens that candidate. That candidate then goes directly into a pre-recorded slot for either a voice interview, depending on the level of customer care representative that we're hiring, or into a situation where they'll go into a pre-recorded video interview via our suite. And that will then go directly into a hiring manager / shared service center based on the score, which will then lead to an offer being generated for that candidate. So within 2 or 3 minutes of applying, that candidate knows whether they've got an interview and what the next steps are. So a highly efficient process in which they're given feedback no matter where they fall out in the process as well.
And Mike and Darko, I think this is also an excellent example of where an organisation is working with us to really deploy the strength of their brand and their building their employer brand for contingent talent to directly reach out through marketing exercises and branded talent pools. So we are seeing this increase of direct sourcing and the deployment of brand in the contingent talent process. So Darko, tell us a little bit more about this one.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as a concept, it's not new, right? It has been happening in Europe, in large parts of the world. We have seen similar concepts on the permanent side. It's only now that it's coming on the contingent side, but we are pretty amazed at the pace of adoption over here. Every conversation that we've had with enterprises in the last few months, direct sourcing is top of the agenda for them. And it's easy to understand why, right? And the benefits are manifold over here. It provides better and increased access to talent because of the sort of pre-filled or pre-vetted talent pools, provides better talent quality at quicker pace. And last but not the least, it actually also provides quite a bit of cost reduction, beyond the traditional hiring through the staffing suppliers. And Mike, you mentioned some of the programmatic advertising, which brings in all those efficiencies. So net, a big priority for a large number of enterprises and for all the right reasons. Mike, any comments on this in terms of how you are seeing this?
Yeah, so firstly, I think that there'll always be a place for the supply chain within most enterprise organizations, but increasingly, to your point, Arko, organizations who have a strong brand, who invest in that brand, are making the move towards direct sourcing. And whilst you can leverage significant savings from that, we now have a very validated data set that shows when we compare the scores of a third-party supply chain to direct sourcing, we see a higher candidate NPS scores, higher satisfaction from hiring managers around quality of hire, and that the direct source model will typically recruit in a shorter time to fill than what you would get with a third-party supply chain. Now, the key here is choosing the right roles to direct source. But I mean, ultimately, you are moving from somewhat of a purely reactive model to a proactive model, and moving from probably not the nicest label of a mercenary style way of recruiting to almost a patriot style way of recruiting. And that patriot way is the sole purpose of a direct source team is to be an augmentation of your internal talent acquisition team for Contingent. Their goals are your goals. It is, how do I make your hiring community, managing community happy? How do I exceed your savings targets? How do I ensure the quality and time to hire of your contingent talent is in line with your expectations? And we have fees at risk to that. So I feel it's the next evolutionary step of becoming widespread engaged in the MSP 4.0 offering. I would highly recommend organizations to think about it.
Thanks, Mike. And I think one of the strong drivers around direct sourcing and also enabling your brand is really what I think is the most important, D, which is that evolution of diversity, equity and inclusion as a core facet and foundation of MSP 4.0. And I think if we've got anyone from the US today, you know, diversity in the past has really looked at your diverse supplier base. Today, it's moving forward through to really look at how are you amplifying the impact of your strategy with the most diverse workforce in place. So, Arko, I think this is a really exciting development for MSP 4.0, where we can have a beautiful impact on the world of work and organizations and their strategies. So, Arko?
Yeah, sure. I think you hit the nail on its head when you said it's ultimately shifting from a diverse supplier base to actually hiring, diverse workers. It's easier said than done. And it means actually, doing multiple things. First of all, trying to understand where your organization is in terms of DE&I compared to your peers. What are those gaps, and how do you fill that? And not just in terms of finding those diverse sources of talent, but actually, closely working with hiring managers to ensure that their biases are not there, and helping them understand what are the implications of their actions. And last but not the least, what type of diversity you want to focus on is equally important. Whether it's gender diversity, whether it's people of color or racial diversity, people with disability or sort of neurodiversity, LGBTQ. What we are seeing is it's very difficult for one organization to focus on all of these equally at the same time. So it's ultimately a choice and a priority that organizations need to create. Hey, I'll focus on these 2 or 3 first and then move to the other, rather than trying to do everything at the same time and not being able to do too much around it. So Mike, how is this panning out in your conversation with your customers?
Yeah, we've been doing a lot of work on this particular topic, and have quite an advanced customer in the professional services space focused on ensuring that post-COVID, they said, look, we've done a lot of work in our permanent workforce on this because of the uncertainty of the macroeconomic environment. We're going to hire more contingent workers in the future until we have a better line of sight, and we don't want to lose all the great work that we've done on DE&I in the permanent space. Hence, we want to make sure that we're closing the gap there from a contingent perspective as well. And I think the MSP 4.0 value proposition should aim to cover really 3 to 4 things there for customers. One is you should be able to give your customers an insight on what does the market look like for a particular skill set in a particular geography, broken up by experience, gender, ethnicity, etc. so that you help your customers set better targets on what does good look like from a DE&I perspective. Secondly, you should be able to then be in a situation where you can track the gender and ethnicity and neurodiversity, socioeconomically disadvantaged individuals, whatever the ambitions are of your organization, through the funnel to hiring, and ensure that that's done in a way where it doesn't impact decision making, so only certain amounts of individuals have access to that data. And then what you should be able to do is gather all the data from external sources and internal sources and have a consultative conversation with hiring managers to say, do you realize that you've asked for an MBA? An MBA typically reduces applications by 25% from this underrepresented minority group. Do you really need an MBA? And this is the likely impact of us being able to remove that MBA from that process. I think that the last piece of that is also nicely linked into that integrated data platform, whereas if you know what good looks like and you're not having good, well, then you can start to trigger some more proactive either sourcing or programmatic advertising through behavioral or affinity targeting to better balance that mix out. And then you also have the capability through certain technologies like a hired score, for example, which we work closely with, to then adjust certain elements of the process to say, okay, we've identified whether rightly or wrongly there's some conscious or unconscious bias here. We can turn off all of the CVs that go to this particular individual that release the details of or give details around name, education, background, schooling, etc., until we've deployed the right level of training to get that individual to where we need it to be. So I think it's a super exciting space, and I'm really happy to see clients making such proactive and ambitious demands about getting this right in the contingent space as well.
I agree, Mike. So it's time. We're up to our last D. We've had some really good questions come through. And before we get there, we'll just talk about some of the implications of how you can look at your own contingent workforce model and the evolution. But I think we could spend a whole webinar topic on this one, Arko and Mike. And maybe we'll have Arko back, but we also have a new head of global services procurement with Paul Vincent, Mike, which I'm sure we could invite back exactly on this topic. But, you know, we've really seen the scope of the contingent workforce increase and the need for MSP 4.0 to look at that whole scope, like you said, Mike, gig workers, freelancers, independent contractors, temporary workers, and now services procurement. So Arko and Mike, let's close off this last D, and then we can move forward to how can organizations get started around MSP 4.0.
Yeah, sure, Louisa. You know, the statement of work or services procurement is interesting because in many cases for organizations, it falls under the tail end of the spend. And so, you know, many organizations do not have the bandwidth to really focus on this, but we increasingly see this as a bigger part of the spend. And that is where for quite a few years now, MSPs have been playing the role in terms of doing the headcount tracking, the classification, ultimately providing that entire visibility into what this spend is, which is great. But the big change that we see now happening in MSP 4.0 is MSPs also helping to actively manage that spend, impact that spend, and ultimately, where possible, to reduce that spend. You know, with the right analytics, with the right sourcing techniques, with the right category management, really sort of impacting the spend over here. And that is where, if we go back to one of the value propositions of MSP 4.0, we talked about exponential cost efficiencies or exponential cost savings beyond what we have seen earlier, and this can be one of those. Actively managing that tail spend, which is not so small anymore. So, Mike, any examples that you've done with your clients on this?
Sure. I mean, you mentioned earlier that HR and TA continue to get involved in the contingent space, and we absolutely see that. And what we see is that's allowing procurement some extra capacity to start to think about how do I think about adding value to this statement of work space, which is often quite a large untapped area for organizations. And we see organizations, or at least procurement leaders, being very deliberate and intentional about how they tackle this. And it's a go slowly thought process is my experience. So firstly, it's about line managers are the budget owners for that statement of work. The first thing we want to do is be able to just provide better insights to those line managers or budget owners about how they're working with statement of work providers at the moment. And I was having a conversation with a customer last week who said, all I want is like a Domino's pizza app for SOW. I want to know who's making it, where is it, where is it in terms of getting delivered, and is it going to get delivered when I expect it? And that's the level one stuff. That's all I need to know from that. And from that, we can create greater amounts of data by which we can then go back and just help the budget owner make better decisions about how they get work done with their statement of work providers in the future. So that visibility, the transparency, and then bringing insights with recommendations is kind of the level one stuff that we see. The level two then becomes the ability to think about tackling the 150K tail end spend, where you could look at automated bidding of particular platforms. You can look to leverage kind of artificial intelligence to help hiring managers write statement of work, etc. I mean, it's a highly evolutionary space, but there's lots of third-party providers that we're working with that are really kind of adding significant value to organizations here. But it's, in my experience, about absolutely understanding the client, meeting them where they're at, so that you can help them partner to get continued value creation out of this space that's at a pace of change that's right for them.
Thanks, Mike. And I know it is a hot topic in the market today, so we'll look to host a session around this moving forward. So let's take a dive into some of the key implications. We do have a little bit of time to go, and we've got a couple of good questions to answer as well, but it has really shifted the nature of the engagement. And Arko, there is one good question that is, this is MSP 4.0 has got some wonderful evolution to it, and it's going to create a lot of impact for companies. How do you see MSP 4.0 being funded, and do you see it being client funded? So I think that's a good one when you have a look at the implications.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll answer that question. But, overall, what we see is, MSPs moving away from just being executioners of the process, but rather partnering with organizations to impact their overall workforce strategy. Of course, the contingent workforce strategy, but ultimately all types of workforce, and how that workforce enables that organization to ultimately achieve their business outcomes. So the overall role of organizations is likely to, of MSPs is likely to change. And to the question on how it's supposed to be funded, actually we have just touched upon it in the paper. I believe there will be some slow shift towards more of a client-funded model. It won't be a rapid shift because it's a big cultural change. The supplier-funded model is very deeply ingrained over here, but we believe that it can, come closer to the broader outsourcing world norms. What we see in the BPO world or what we see in the IT outsourcing world, where it's always client-funded. But one sort of, I think that's related to another question that is out there is, what are we doing to help enterprises, shift to this? And that is actually, how do you measure the MSP success? How do you, build the business case for MSP? And that goes much beyond cost savings. So Mike, over to you in terms of how you are helping clients measure the success of the MSP programs.
Yeah, so thank you, Michael. I think you've got the traditional. I think you've got the traditional drivers of how you would measure a contingent / MSP value proposition. With the MSP 4.0, what we wanted to do was create an opportunity for current customers and potential new customers to benchmark where their current MSP is. And we're more than happy to engage with any attendees on the call today to give you an understanding of where is your MSP at market, what are the key areas that you're looking to move the needle on, what does good look like, for example, when it comes to market intelligence or a digital platform experience, etc. So I'm sure Lou will be providing some details for customers to follow up with us on that, but we're excited to be able to provide that real quantitative and qualitative benchmark for customers to understand where they are on their roadmap, backed by a significant amount of data for our recommendations.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks, Arko. We've managed to weave a few questions in on the throughout today, so we have run out of time. There is a bit of interest around client-funded versus supplier-funded. So, Arko, might come back to you and get a little bit more write-up. It is included some elements in the report. But as we wrap up, probably what you'll find after the session today is the MSP 4.0 white paper. We'll be sharing that with you with much greater insight around all of the topics we've discussed today, and it will cover all of the Ds, the full 8 Ds. And if you're a member of hcri.org, this session today does have the official seal, so please don't hesitate to use this information to claim your credits towards your program. So we will share all of this following the session today. A big thank you to Arko for hosting this with us. We've been proud to really look at how organizations elevating their MSP 4.0. And Mike, most definitely, if anyone is interested, please reply or respond, and we look forward to helping organizations benchmark where their contingent workforce model is today and how can they start to really drive change and evolution in the key levers that have been shared. So thank you, Arko and Mike.
Pleasure.
Thank you. Pleasure.